Hello. Are you ready? Yeah? So, welcome everybody. Welcome to 192 Books, and welcome to those joining us online. We are live streaming tonight's event, which will also be archived on our page at pcgstudio.com. So you can explore, you can go back to this event or explore past events on that page. It's a true pleasure to welcome David Levering-Lewis, a distinguished historian whose work has profoundly shaped our understanding of American history, to celebrate the publication of his new book, The Stained Glass Window, A Family History as the American Story, 1790 to 1958. Professor Lewis is emeritus at New York University. He's the author of 12 books, including his acclaimed multi-volume biography of W.E.B. Du Bois, for which he's best known, and which earned him not one, but 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He's also written biographies of Martin Luther King and the improbable Wendell Willkie, an anti-fascist Republican and civil rights champion from the 1930s, an unthinkable combination that seems today. His other works cover a wide range of topics, from the Harlem Renaissance and anti-colonial resistance in Africa to the Dreyfus Affair and medieval Islam. Lewis's scholarly achievements have earned him numerous awards and fellowships, including from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation, as well as the Bancroft Prize in American History and the Parkman Prize. In 2009, he received the National Humanities Medal from President Obama. The Stained Glass Window takes us on a nearly 200-year journey, sparked by a moment of reflection beneath a stained glass window dedicated to Professor Lewis's grandmother in an Atlanta church where his family had worshipped for generations. Through the stories of his ancestors, particularly 2 white slaveholding families, a family of free people of color, and an African-American family rising from slavery, Lewis moves through the antebellum South, the Civil War, the aftermath of the separate but equal Supreme Court decision, and into the civil rights era. In so doing, he excavates a multi-generational history shaped by the seesaw of ambition and restraint, opportunity and limitation, integration and segregation, progress and backlash, opposing forces that have defined much of the African-American experience ever since it was first held to be self-evident that all men are created equal. While Lewis's narrative ends in 1958, its implications continue to resonate today. Like the contemplative window in the title, and reading the separation between stained and glass, a little bit like a line break in a poem, the radiant ideals and aspirations enshrined in America's past may continue to shine, but its stains cast long shadows over the present. There's something inherently compelling about historians who turn to their own families as subjects of study, balancing personal engagement with scholarly objectivity. Weaving the micro of family lore with the macro of larger historical trends as rigorously as he does, Lewis challenges us to appreciate the nuance and complexity of the past. He brings to light the contrasting forces of privilege and oppression that shape us, but he also highlights the agency and indeed the responsibility we all have to respond and shape these forces in turn. In a time of great dread, when historical currents seem overwhelming, his book, and indeed all of his work, serves as a much-needed reminder that each of us is not only a part of history, but also creates it. So we will, Professor Lewis will read from the book and discuss it, and then we'll have a short Q&A where you'll be able to ask questions. And after that, we'll break, and you can get a copy of the book, and Professor Lewis will be happy to sign it. And please join me in welcoming David Levering-Lewis.
I'm going to have a confession that I have just arrived from Atlanta after going to Washington, and I arrived to find that my Mac has snarled badly. It's equipped with AI, and it had already offered to spare me this evening the effort of writing anything. I declined, but my machine is snarled badly, and so I have to read from the book in a way that is perhaps a little choppy. I apologize. I will do my best. With that introduction, though, which seemed to me to seize the sense of the book so well and succinctly, I thought I would tell you how I happened to write this book. This is the 12th book. The Los Angeles Times reviewer she was rather complimentary, but she did say that that she welcomed the result of so many years of scholarship, and that no doubt this was the end of my long career. Still, she spelled my name correctly, and it's a positive review altogether. However, I thought I would tell you how this book actually happened. And I'm going to read from the acknowledgments that are in the book, but I will take these pages that capture that moment, the stained glass window. This book owes its life to a morning phone call that came just as I was leaving London 10 years ago to assuage the loss of my wife of 30 years. I thought better of answering. The caller was editor of two successful books of mine, Henry Holt's John McCrae. Conversations with Jack were notable for length or significance, neither of which in my present mental state was I inclined to indulge. The London getaway meant 2 compatible weeks in a family timeshare, random strolls, getaway aplenty, Cambridge museums and movies, free-range conversation. Haphazardly, packed and anxious to leave, I risked the landline. He had heard that I had a new book in mind. Tell me in just a few words about it, Jack insisted. In fact, as I said hurriedly, whatever I had in mind was too inchoate to formulate. One word, he insisted. The Lewis family history told as the American story, I laughed. Back in 2 weeks, I said to end our exchange. Before cradling the phone, the voice guaranteed that I would hear from it again in 2 weeks. A decade after that London fortnight, followed by a triangle-building meeting with Holt Panjandrums, excited about an imagined family book, such a book finally appears from Penguin Random House. The Stained Glass Window. John McCrae III, the Stained Glass Window follows this author's ill-timed, improbable Wendell Willkie. John McCrae III, retired and promised the family history told as the American story, is a cherished memory, along with my unforgettable spouse, Ruth Ann Stewart. And 12 books in a career is a respectable enough number to sign off with a much overdue dedication to my deceased parents, John Henry and Alice Ernestine Lewis, and to my indispensable Dolores, whose surname is the root of my resilient life. I've also dedicated this book. And so this is my 12th, The Stained Glass Window, A Family History as the American Story, 1790-1958, from the first republic, the first census of the republic, to the 1958 death of my father. Because this 380-page narrative is crammed with names and dates and places and sometimes surprising historical interpretations, allow me to begin by saying that what I hope you will understand was its master thesis, the stained glass window. And I think I probably have a page that well, it is true that my Mac was very difficult, but I thought I did. Well, we'll just say that the stained glass window shifts the fundamentals of the national story by retelling that story across the lives of 4 of my own family units. 2 of them white, Kings and Belvins, the 3rd free and colored, the Bells, and the 4th, an up from slavery success story, the Lewises. And so the point of this family history is its success in wrapping the lives of these Kings, Belvins, Bells, and Lewises around almost 200 years of North American history. And so I think my book is an exceptional book, not only, or not merely, in that it explains macro history as family history. It is unique in that the book's author tells 4 stories about his own origins within the folds of the antebellum slavery project, and then of the long national separate but equal aftermath whose inconclusive end has guaranteed the inconclusive national presence. And so I should now read a bit from the book to illustrate what I hope I have accomplished. I needed to find the origins of the person who is in the stained glass window. My grandmother, Alice King Bell. She passed in 1908, age 29, in childbirth, and had left her aggrieved family to memorialize her later. And indeed, that was done, not when she died in 1901, but some 9 years later, when the church that was alluded to had reconstructed itself after an extraordinary moment in American history and in Atlanta history, and that was the infamous 1906 pogrom, in which African Americans were persecuted, removed from the voting rolls, and the entire sense of relationships in that city, and indeed in much of the South, were altered irrepressibly. To understand why that person in the stained glass window, how she had lived, what her life and death had meant, and what her demise had meant to my grandparents, I needed to somehow find a source that would be complicit in all of this. And I happened to notice that an archive called the Roswell Historical Archive in Roswell, Georgia, was celebrating that in that time Black History Month. And I found that admirable, but a bit curious as well, as the Roswell Historical Society is not to indulge hyperbole, but it is the grand memory and record of the lost cause. So observing that Black History Month had come to its attention, I phoned and reached the archivist. And I said, this is all very interesting, and I believe that my origins are somehow related to the structure of the King enterprise. and that my grandmother was, in fact, a king. And the archivist said, well, it could be. Why don't you come and let's discuss this? And so soon thereafter, I did. And we spent a delightful morning together in which she indulged my speculations and hypothesis that my mother had indeed been convinced that her mother had her origins as a king and had lived at the King plantation. She thought that unlikely. She thanked me for a pleasant morning. I flew back to New York and thought, well, that was that. And about 4 weeks later came certified information that transformed this quest quite radically. First, she said, oh, dear Professor Lewis, I'm so delighted to tell you that I've located one of your ancestors. Her name is Clarissa, and Clarissa is, she said, your grandmother's mother. Ah, I said, well, that's interesting. And she said, there's more to the story. She was sold at age 17 from Roswell, indeed, this Clarissa. And she emerges in Houston County, the epicenter of the Cotton Empire. She emerges as a handmaiden of a planter's family and the mistress of the plantation. And more than that, she said, it does seem, and the story is truncated, she admitted, I don't have all the details, but it seems that a special relationship grew up between this Clarissa and a member of the family, the Belvin family in Houston County. And that, indeed, going forward, your family was vouchsafed an indenture of property on a street very significant to Atlanta, Auburn Avenue, and that connection remains to be explained, but there you have the basis for a quest, and certainly that was so. Well, it turns out on page 61, that unraveling this mystery happened as we acquired more information about the property, the indenture. But it was whereases and wherefores and whereofs and that sort of thing. And the whole construction of the transaction was murky. However, to the best of our memories, it had been sometime in the fall of 2018 that my partner, Dolores's curiosity about the Belvin indenture yielded an interpretive epiphany. She and I read together the indenture's whereoffs and whereases and the consideration in the October 1881 handwritten document endowing my great-grandmother with prime property located between Atlanta's old and new wheat streets. Clarence White, my father's devoted biographer, and this is a man who, out of the blue, had once sent me an email which described the arc of my father's relative success professionally. And much later, this man who had retired from banking in Chicago, had relocated to Atlanta, and I had back and forth communications with him, but long since had not persevered with the connection. But in any case, when he was in Atlanta, he again signaled his interest in my family, And so he and another friend, a Carol Priest, the genealogist Annapolis friend, had been waiting to hear the backstory of the indenture of James W. Belvin's conveyance for $5 cash in hand paid by the said Clarissa B. King, colored, for her sole and separate use during the term of her natural life on her decease, to her granddaughter, Alice Lee Belvin, for her sole and separate use during the term of her natural life, and to such child or children as she may have. My Clarissa had, after many years living in Houston County, finally delivered a final child, and the child was named Alice Lee Belvin. And that child had become a source of great satisfaction and affection to the planter, James Wiley Belvin, and that too made this story so much more interesting. But suddenly, what should have been too obvious to miss because self-evident on reading the Major's characterization of Alice King as her own mother's granddaughter, had not James Peter Collidon's father finally provided definitive corroboration of his son's paternity of Clarissa's father, finally provided definitive corroboration of his son's paternity of Clarissa's children. Clarissa's children were indeed Belvins. The remaining ancestral curiosity, however, was great-grandmother's unshaken possession of the King patronymic, an identity notwithstanding the Major's renaming that of her as her last child. Alice King would also proudly retain. Was there a controlling origin story in which a 13-year-old Elsie conceived Barrington King's Clarissa? And that requires just a bit of backgrounding. In 1802, the heir to the great King plantation in Roswell had purchased a bundle of human beings, and among them was a woman named Elsie, who may well have, in some sense, have been especially attractive to Barrington King. And she, of course, will at some point also be the mother of Clarissa. So Carol's recommendation was to result in a radical narrative revision of Clarissa King's biography and of my lineage. Carol still thought I needed to work with a professional genealogist in order to protect yourself from some critique of your methodology in this day and age. Finally persuaded, I sought the advice of Mary Helen Thompson, a genealogist friend. It seemed the DNA variables of my ancestral quest might be better served through the trees, a genealogical enterprise, ancestral enterprise with impressive through-the-line capabilities. My problem, I explained to the genealogist, according to family history, my maternal lineage derived from the Kings of Roswell, Georgia. Explaining that I had no knowledge of Belvin antecedents until recently, I stressed that my compelling concern was to falsify my mother's belief that her mother was a king. Nothing was heard for an anxious month. The report came back. While this project began as an investigation of Alice King's ancestry, any genetic evidence of Alice having descended from a documented King family member at this time is inconclusive. Although deeply disappointed by the genealogist's finding, I cannot say that I was completely surprised. Indeed, recalling the solipsism that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, I found solace in believing that Mother could still have been right. However, the next revelation practically reduced me to several days of incoherence. Further analysis of the unweighted amounts of DNA David Lewis shares with the DNA-tested Belvin family members, his written report decreed, is statistically much more likely to have sired Alice. I should skip the line. Suggests that James W. Belvin, the father of the boy, is statistically much more likely to have sired Alice King. The short of his finding was that far too little autosomal DNA was shared between Culloden and me, the son, no Rembert genes for David Levering Lewis. Belvin federal census schedules, family wills and property deeds, tax receipts, local newspapers, James Peter Belvin's impressionistic chronology, Roswell Historical Society and Perry Area Historical Society archival evidence, and historical monographs, none of it alone or in combination unmasked the cloaked bloodlines of history's dominant and subjected. And so, discovering that I'm descended from a major planter and hero of the Confederacy, I wish to know more. And I found this, that Major Belvin, the James W. Belvin, who is now my grandfather, probably lasted only a few days going to Atlanta, or only went for a few days going to Atlanta in September of 1879. And given the nature of his business, it's possible that great-grandmother Clarissa accompanied him because his business there was for her. The veil separating the races, memorialized 38-odd years later by a young Atlanta University professor, was more like a loose garment 3 years after the end of Reconstruction. A well-dressed woman of color in the company of a white gentleman whose ship-like dimensions rolled along in the company along with them might have been an unusual sight, though not a rare one. The business that September 19, whether or not she was present, was the purchase for Clarissa of a parcel of land occupied by a large two-story frame dwelling on Wheat Street, 4 lots from the Jackson Street intersection. The seller, Moses Frank, was a prominent Jewish businessman. A century and a half later, when Clarence White and I located the bill of sale for $700 and in the basement of the Fulton County Superior Court, we wondered instantly if this Moses Frank might not be a relative of the Leo Frank, whose 1913 mistrial and mob murder disgraced Atlanta's Gentile leadership, scandalized much of the country, yet also represented a broad skein of anti-Semitism previously contained. We did indeed confirm that it had been Moses Frank who invited his ill-fated nephew to Atlanta to invest in a match factory. 14 years after Moses Frank sold his property, Wheat Street became Auburn Avenue, the prized artery of African American commercial, religious, and social associations affectionately called Sweet Auburn. It would have been a good bet that the property James Wiley Belvin bought for Clarissa King in 1879 would maintain its value and probably appreciate, even if Moses Frank undoubtedly exercised savvy timing by selling just as his neighborhood opened to the better class of colored people. Clarissa's 8-room domicile set imposingly back from the street. She must have thought it fit for kings. Obtaining Wheat Street was the first of a 2-part plan that spoke volumes about the depth of J.W. and Clarissa's quarter-century timeline of discreet involvement. The final indenture transferring Wheat Street to great-grandmother was different from the original. In the first version, 1879, the Major had retained a reversionary interest to his estate should great-grandmother daughter Alice die without issue. That this reversionary clause was eliminated 2 years later, however, reflected Clarissa's persuasive powers of correction. After all, as the 1880 federal census for Atlanta showed, all but one of Clarissa's children, her firstborn, Adela, lived with her husband and 3 children nearby, were with their grandmother, Elsie, at 276 Wheat Street under the name of King. Charles, 22, James, 14, Alice, 8. The final indenture the Major filed with the court in October 1881 must have been, in his eyes, an equity dispensation for the many years of Clarissa's captive sexual service and their parallel family history. I've been asked, though, how I know much about my great-grandmother, Clarissa, that she probably was not literate, that she left no text from which we could make judgments about her, that this is in fact the commonplace of people, enslaved people, male and female. We do not know really what they thought genuinely, and we do not know what their ambitions might have been. But in this case, we have, by virtue of what actually happens in freedom, answers to that difficult epistemological question that vexes so many female historians of today. With this second indenture, the Major and his former enslaved solemnized their coexistence, entered into this first day of August 1800 and 1881 between James Belvin and Clarissa B. King for and in consideration of the former services and fidelity of said Clarissa King while a slave, and the further consideration of the sum of $5 cash in hand paid by the said Clarissa B. King, the indenture declared that 267 Wheat Street, with all and singular rights, members, and appurtenances thereof, belonged to the said Clarissa B. King and Alice Lee Belvin during their natural lives. The self-serving reversionary clause had disappeared. Had Alice Lee Belvin died without issue, then the property hereby conveyed shall revert to other children of the said Clarissa B. King. The Major's indenture retained a significant exclusion, however, that my great-grandmother's property rights, to wit, the marital rights of her present or any future husband, were excluded from great-grandmother's property rights. So I would say that Clarissa emerged from bondage in freedom quite successfully, a property owner a person whose property holdings were guaranteed by virtue of an indenture, that her influence must have caused, in terms of the changes that were made between the first indenture, which had a reversionary clause, and the second, which granted all rights to her. So there was an Alice Lee Belden, the daughter of Clarissa King, and she will change her name as soon as she can to Alice King. And she will, enjoying the usufruct of her family possessions and her education at Atlanta University, a school that followed the model of New England schools in terms of its curriculum and its aspirations. She will marry in 1891 my grandfather. Quite a catch captured in the photographs, studio photographs that adorn this book. However, my grandfather was a rather special sort of person as well. He, though born in Atlanta 2 years after the Civil War, was descended from free persons of color whose ancestry went back to the founding of the Republic. John Henry Bell was descended from a woman we can discover in the first census of the Republic, the census of 1790, when a small person, the census enumerator judged she was probably 4 years old in the 1790 census. We can find in the next census and the following census by census, as she matures, and this Martha Jemima Bell becomes the matriarch of a thriving but insignificant, really, in terms of politics, in terms of economics, but in terms of racial definition, terribly significant Bells, decade by decade. How did this happen? Well, it's so complicated that indeed I would recommend reading the complications in the book. But there was a period of emancipations about 20 or 30 years right after the American Revolution began in 1775. And so historians have counted the numbers of people who were actually manumitted, not a large number indeed, until that practice petered out well before 1790. But it must have been that Martha Jemima Bell came into the world a free baby, and therefore, by the Latin of the times, all her descendants would be free persons of color. She's fascinating because by 1820, she has matured, and we know from a 2-volume history, curiously, written by Richard Heitzler of Goose Creek, we discover that she lived among a quite gaggle of free persons of color in the upcountry outside Charleston, mostly in a place called Goose Creek, St. Peter's Parish. And there we see in 1820, she is in fact running a rice plantation, managing it herself. Oh, this is interesting, but she soon will have a companion, and the companion is the owner of that rice plantation. I'll just say parenthetically that the business about rice production, which so concerns South Carolina, historians has, I think, now been resolved, and that rice, the Glaberrima rice product, was a gift of the enslaved to the planting class. And it has been established, indeed, that rice planting was a success story passed to the planters from the Africans themselves. In any case, she is a maum or manager of a rice plantation. Well, where's the owner of the plantation? Well, by the 1820s, Goose Creek, for reasons of soil decay, and the appeal of the high life of Charleston, the planters had moved into Charleston, leaving most of these plantations to be managed by overseers, mostly white, but there were these exceptions. And one of the plantations was called Four Hole Swamp, and we can find it on the map. And indeed, as you open the book, you will see a depiction of Four Hole Swamp, which was particularly lubricious because the cypress trees in the background were responsible for a great deal of soil being carried downstream by various rivers, making that plantation exceedingly rich for rice cultivation. And in about 1820, she receives a visitor, a man who has decided to leave Charleston and return to his property in what is Four Hole Swamp. He comes with a wife. She perishes, alas, very shortly. And the mutual attraction between Martha Jemima Bell and Isaac Bradwell begins. And soon there will be a family of some 5 males and 1 daughter by Isaac Bradwell, a very significant Caucasian planter who they will remain together for that decade. And then Isaac Bradwell will marry again and leave Four Hole Swamp and go to one of the parishes called Colton. But there he will also lose that second wife, and so we find him again back at Four Hole Swamp. And so we have then this family of free people in a chapter that I describe as an identity of their own people. This is fascinating because of what will happen in the next reading that I propose to make. And that is that although, as Ira Berlin has described the free people of South Carolina and indeed of much of the South as slaves without masters, and that's much too simplistic to describe their rather effective anonymity, but at the same time the minimal prosperity that they acquire down through the years. And so Martha Jemima's children will gradually end up in Charleston City, and they will expand the population of free persons, of free people who maintain or sustain the craftsman universe of Charleston. They are tailors, and they are carpenters, and they are many, many things that are essential to municipal life. And they begin to live, we can see their names again, James and Raphael and others as they established themselves in Charleston. However, Charleston and South Carolina is a booming colony, or by now a state, and many, many whites, both farmers and craftsmen, come to Charleston and find that they are cut out of the universe of craftsmanship by the excellent positioning of these mulattoes and free people. And this causes a kind of class conflict that is, I think, fascinating. It means that finally, from Columbia, we have a mayor, a governor, and we have a mayor who represents the working class whites of the state. And finally, there are increasing proposals to remand many of the colored and free people, craftsmen, back into slavery. And by 1856, 1858, indeed, for the first time, Charleston has a mayor who represents the working class whites, anxious to displace the mulatto and free persons from their quasi monopoly. And so, let me see, I think there is a particular complaint that I think seizes this class conflict so well that I hope to find it just now. Yes, one of the most successful heirs of great wealth was an Edward Lorenz, a family that had prospered enormously in the transatlantic slave trade. He no longer does that sort of thing. It's, gets your fingers dirty. But he makes a complaint, an observation. He says his family wealth originated in the Atlantic slave trade, but he lamented the rising success of free persons of color. And he said, walk through the streets of our ill-fated city, he lectured his peers in 1832, and see how certainly and how surely and how rapidly all the mechanical arts and all the ordinary avocations were becoming overstocked by persons of color, to the detriment of, quote, he said, the bone and sinew of our population. When white working class impatience finally reached its peak in the wake of Bleeding Kansas and Harper's Ferry, the Columbia legislature tabled 20 bills in 1859, in the 1859 session, imposing new restrictions or expulsions of reenslavement of free Negroes. Yet, as historian Bernard Powers, whose Avery research, well, I'll skip that, as butchers, tailors, barbers, coopers, and carpenters, they carved out a defiant slice of the city's economy. And so, but there were, of course, there was a very powerful and really quite rich free class of African Americans, both colored and not. Men like Thomas Bonneau, Anthony Weston, Francis Cardozo, and Robert DeLarge wanted to be seen, as biographers Michael Johnson and James Roark described their protagonist, William Ellison, as not a black man, but a man of color, a mulatto, a man neither black nor white, a brown man. William Ellison, cotton gin designer, slaveholder, cultured family man, apotheosis of his class, and probably the richest man of color outside Louisiana, would die at 70 in his commodious yet unpretentious Stateburg Manor House 8 months after Fort Sumter was bombarded. If Isaac Bradwell said nothing about Denmark Vesey, that is another issue that I will skip. And so, nevertheless, new mayor Charles Macbeth rode into office in 1860 with the first poor white majority in Charleston's history. A trove of remarkable letters discovered in 1935 underneath a Stateburg house captures the angst of the FPC's, Free People of Color, as the curtain of exceptionalism descends on an imperiled class. The Ellison son-in-law, James Johnson, maintained a lordly sang-froid as late as December 1859, writing from Charleston that nothing would be done affecting our position, using their kinship work and associations that define their community of some 120 families. One hears them say, as they stood up to policemen and bullies, they called on the mayor and demanded that he quash damaging rumors. They kept in touch with the whites who remained their friends. But one problem guaranteed their ascendancy and guaranteed Martha Jemima's craftsman sons. And that was, of course, that the practice was that when you worked and were permitted to work amongst in the economy, part of what you raised was remitted to your masters. And so the master class had a very good reason never really to cave into the working class because they undercut the wages, but at the same time they enriched the master class. And so there is where things stood, just as the cannonade of Beauregard fired on Fort Sumter and changed the dynamic entirely. And what it does is it presents a problem for Martha Jemima's free mulattoes. And that is that now we have the unenslaved. The slaves now will be able to displace the mulattoes. And so they read the tea leaves and they leave Charleston and they end up in Atlanta, where they will create a new compost of activity that is fascinating. And perhaps I should read one more example of this and then invite some comment and questions. And that's chapter 4, page 99 and 101. Yes, there are Lewises in this drama, and I thought that their attempt to rise in a situation in which great violence is abundant in the 1860s, especially in 1868, in the election of Ulysses Grant after the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And this, I think, may get the color of what is going on. Today, Schley County, Georgia, has the distinction of bordering Plains County, birthplace and periodic residence of James Earl Jimmy Carter, 39th president. In that July of 1958, Schley County observed the dedication of the John H. Lewis Consolidated High School at Ellaville, county seat. My father had shared news of this seeming distinction With the usual wry composure, he reserved for unanticipated breaks in the color line, now less rare since Martin Luther King Jr.'s triumphant 1955-56 Montgomery bus boycott. He was proud that even in a backwater place 125 miles due south from Atlanta, enough people were stirred by the Times and the local Sun's renown to wring a long overdue concession from Schley County's Board of Education. My best memory of the school dedication is of an early Saturday morning start, myself at the wheel of our Buick Roadmaster, as Dad and I headed down U.S. Highway 1941 for the Ellaville, known to me only from Aunt Susie's family history. My Aunt Susie had written a quite complete family history, but none of us believed in its accuracy. The heavyset gentleman, ours was a time-stopped Saturday afternoon, never erased from my memory after seeing the eponymous brick structure sprawled across 20 hilltop acres. The heavyset gentleman hurrying to our parked car prompted my father's brusque exit, exclamatory salutation, and effusive embrace. Frederick Douglass, F.D. Harold, had been an outstanding undergraduate athlete from Cotton Belt, Georgia, when young John Lewis was president of Morris Brown College 35 or more years prior. It was obvious that Harold's lifetime service as Schley County teacher, principal, and all-purpose coach had somehow conjured the race relations wizardry that made this dedication ceremony and our presence possible. I learned much later that until John Lewis High School was built, Ellaville's only public school for black youth had been a 1928 wooden structure with a 7-month school term for grades 1 through 10. For most black males, public school had ended after the 3rd or 4th grade. But on that day, our arms interlocked, Principal Harold propelled my father and me before a congregation of local worthies distributed into 2 racially separate receiving lines of curious black and white inspectors. We walked as through a biracial gauntlet of greetings, extended hands, questions, and biblical exclamations. One voice above the commotion, black and regal, broadcast a boyhood memory of my father. Another, white and authoritative, boasted its delight that John's made us all proud down here. I banked in my memory compliments paid my septuagenarian father by several mature ladies before he appeared at the speaker's platform. A supremely satisfied Frederick Douglass Harold stood ready to introduce Dr. John Henry Lewis. My father's speech was pure Horatio Alger joins the NAACP, climaxed by an uncharacteristically fatherly notice of me, all well received. We departed after an attentive tour of library, classrooms, basketball court, and assembly hall, and the sizable luncheon spooned by sizable ladies. Dad's facial expression signaled enough toleration of choreographed biracial black slapping, Jim Crow etiquette, as it were. We discussed Aunt Susie's family history on the road out of Ellaville back to Atlanta. She gave us a Proustian opportunity to share a lost crime that I intuited would, given Dad's weak heart, probably never return. How had he surpassed his past was what I needed to know. I had learned from Aunt Susie's history that grandparents Hetty Smith and Sim Lewis produced 7 children, and I'll mention them. To my question, Dad answered that it had been most unusual for Berry Lewis to emerge from slavery a property owner. The fact, he said, enabled his father, Simeon, or Sim, to acquire considerable cotton belt farmland. But it seems the law of mortgage perpetuity finally ruined him, Dad sighed. Then followed his thought train to Oglethorpe, where his defeated father moved with his family and died, age 44, in 1903. His thoughtful mood turned uncharacteristically confessional within a few miles of the capital. I learned that Hattie and the chronicling Susie had financed both his and his physician brother's education, starting early with African Methodist Episcopal schools or American Missionary Association schools for boys. Hattie compensated for her sixth grade education with a banker's acumen, whereas her oldest child, self-sacrificing Susie, put her future on hold for the family. Americus, a few miles farther south, offered them more opportunity. Dad recalled how his mother and sister's corner store sold provisions and farm supplies, made loans, and served as Americus's black labor exchange. Rereading Susie's family history a day later, several passages struck home. Deeply interested in my brothers and sisters, I gladly gave up the most of my earnings for their education, Susie quotes her sister Maisie's praise. Sister holding to God's almighty hand and working side by side with Mother, did not let go until Brother John finished Morris Brown, Yale University, and the University of Chicago, and Smith had completed the medical course at Howard University. So that's the Lewises. And then perhaps just page 180 and 81. And I will not read more, but invite your questions, please. This is about the Atlanta riot of 1906, this ghastly pogrom. And this is one of the consequences to my grandfather. His wife had died in 1901, his first wife. He had interred her in the Atlanta cemetery, the Oakland Cemetery, the cemetery reserved for families of some success and significance. But the riot has happened. John Henry Bell's mail rounds made him more and more depressed over the next few weeks. The shuttered, ransacked black businesses along Decatur, Marietta, and Peters looked damaged beyond repair. Moreover, the proliferation of for colored only signs was a new development throughout the city, and they were matched by for whites only. People he knew, even some whites he didn't seem to go out of their way to greet and even halt to chat. A miasma of enforced correctness lay upon ordinary interactions. The new politics of official segregation appalled him, and coming as soon as Hoke Smith's November inauguration, the man who has won the governorship, were ballot box algorithms removing all but a handful of African American voters. Exactly when grandfather decided to do so is uncertain. He and Alice had identified themselves and their two children as mulatto in the 1900 federal census. 6 years later, grandmother's presence in Oakland Cemetery suddenly became problematic for her family, whose identity as no nation people, and I will comment on what no nation means if that inspires any questions, was becoming illogical. Walter White, my mother's Oglethorpe classmate, experienced an identity catharsis that late September week in 1906 that he described unforgettably 40 years later in A Man Called White, his autobiography. As the white mob departed his family's front yard, Walter realized, I was a Negro from that day. I was not white. There is nothing within my mind and heart which tempts me to think I am. His was a rebirth equally experienced by John Henry Bell and his children. My maternal grandfather hired 2 men and a brace to remove his wife from Oakland Cemetery and a resting spot that would no longer be available to him when he died as a Negro.
I'm glad you read this last passage because it is indeed so important. So let's open the floor to questions. Does anyone?
I can read again. And
well,
I do apologize. I am simply hamstrung by a collapse of my computer as I return from a distance, and this is the best I could do. Yes.
You did very well.
First of all, confirmed Luddite. I totally understand that situation.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about how the trajectory of the family follows the trajectory of history and some of the interesting markers that you found along the way?
Yes. I thought that, say, the mulattoes of South Carolina and later of Atlanta illustrated just one point, and that was the contextuality of race. These people are white at one point, and at another point they are not. At another point they are not quite sure what they are. And the term no nation was useful, I think, because when I was writing and researching Du Bois's life, I went to Atlanta to people who might have been his students. And I found one who was a colleague of my mother's. She was now dead. And she said, yes, Du Bois was just marvelous, and we learned so much. And your mother was, she was so smart. She did everything. In fact, she was the best no-nation person I've ever met. And I said, excuse me, what are we saying? And she said, there were no-nation people. They all went to that church, and they all were different, and they didn't quite fit in, but they were terrific people. And I said, that's really interesting, isn't it? Contextuality of identity is a major message, I think, in a chapter, an identity of their own. Success is illustrated, it seems to me, by the determination of my father to be one of the first Yale Divinity graduates, and then to go to the University of Chicago right after finishing Yale Divinity, and with the great hope that he would have his PhD in sociology, as Booker Washington's amanuensis had just returned to the university to head up what will become American sociology. And that man's name eludes me for just a moment but we all know who we're talking about. They headed the Chicago School of Sociology. Indeed, he instead went off to teach and married and had many children, and therefore would not be conveniently able to get his PhD. But he went on to do other things, and he illustrates something about the dichotomy in the African-American experience from the 1890s until really not so long ago, and it was the heroic battle between those people who advocated vocational education and those who said there must be room for people who are philosophers and humanists and what have you, between the Du Boisians and the Bookerites, you might say. And my father was caught right in the middle of that because when he finished Chicago and returned to, well, actually, I have to go forward. When he became president of Morris Brown College, which was the flagship below the Mason-Dixon line of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, he immediately reached out to the foundation that made all the decisions about higher education. And I hope that Mr. Trump doesn't remember how effective they were. And that was the General Education Board founded by the Rockefellers. And so my father made connections with the Secretary General of the General Education Board, and it advantaged his school in terms of funds that were appropriated for salaries and for improvement of structure and that sort of thing. By 1928, the school was quite in debt, and there were politics that resulted in his leaving the school. But that connection will be quite important later to him when the General Education Board in 1915 decided, with the death of Booker Washington, that they needed to step back, all the great foundations, and look at African American education and what they should have. And the result of that was a major document on black higher education, a 2-volume work funded by one of the new foundations. And again, my short-term memory is a problem. I think it was the Phelps-Stokes Fund that funded it. And there was a debate about whether or not vocational education indeed took care of African Americans. And in an interesting exchange that John Hope, who will soon be the president of the new Rockefeller-funded Atlanta University, is there at Broad Street that morning in 1915 with Mr. Robert Russell Moton, who has succeeded the great Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee. And there, the debate is, as Mr. Hope thinks, it is for pure vocational education at the cost of the higher pursuits. And he says, is this what is going to happen? And the Secretary General says, that is exactly what is going to happen. Unlike what happened with women, when we let them do what men do, we are not going to let African Americans do that. That was a costly mistake. And so that debate roils African American higher education through the decades, with generally the impoverishment of it for the benefit of vocationalism. I think it's fair to say. So my father, reading all of these debates and what have you, when he becomes, when he finds that the Rosenwald Fund has decided on a grand high school to be its finale in terms of service to African Americans. And for some reason, my father is chosen to head that high school, Dunbar High School. And a great debate began before the school was even built. The architects were the architects of Central, who reduced the size of Dunbar, but mimicked the same plan. Gorgeous school it really was. And so the locals said, look, we want collegiate education, for heaven's sake. And finally, there were people within the Rosenwald, but especially in the General Education Board, who said, well, they do have a point, you know. And so my father seemed to be someone who could triangulate the oppositions of aspirations. And he ran that school for 14 very successful years. And as the reviewer in the Wall Street Journal noted, it was the outstanding African American high school going. Choices have to be made. The teachers, after so many years, noticed that the discrepancy between salaries based on race were appalling and worsening, and so they wished to protest. And finally, they decided they would even sue. Mind you, they only wanted what was equal under Plessy versus Ferguson, just equal salaries. The NAACP, it's new to the game, and young Thurgood Marshall has just had his great success at the University of Maryland, and so these teachers reach out to him. The decision of the NAACP is that is the most phlegmatic branch of the NAACP you've ever seen. We don't know that we want to take it on because it just doesn't seem to be very active and animated. The teachers, though, had a different point of view, and they filed suit in federal court. And Thurgood Marshall famously said, "By George, these Arkansas teachers have suddenly discovered backbone. I have to go and help them out." He arrives, and there's my father, the principal of that high school. And so we have the suit before the federal Justice Trimble, in which the position of the teachers is dismissed as irrelevant to the 14th Amendment, has nothing to do with Plessy versus Ferguson, and so on. However, says Judge Trimble, as a courtesy, we would hear the one person selected by my father and Thurgood Marshall to represent the cause, Sue Cowan Marshall, I think her name, yes. And so much later, she comes before the judge. And there, she, with directed studies at the University of Chicago, I suppose strategically, presented herself marvelously well. However, Thurgood Marshall asked my father to have an opinion about her worthiness. And he knew that that was the end of his career at Dunbar. And so he said, yes, that with his degrees and his experience and his understanding of what the General Education Board would have wanted, Miss Cowan her cause should prevail. It was ruled insufficient, and there was an appeal to the Eighth Circuit Court, but most teachers thought, well, that's the end of the game. My father and Thurgood Marshall then write to each other about this situation in the most interesting way, worthy, I think, of capturing in this book. And then my father proudly has to go and find another place to make his professional use, which will mean leaving the South. And that's interesting because we're going to be with Thurgood Marshall when a similar situation arises a few years later, when the incrementalist approach that the NAACP had stood by and had rather effectively made some progress for is barred in South Carolina, curiously enough, by a federal judge who says, Mr. Marshall, I will not receive your brief unless you revise it. And that brings us to what? It brings us to Brown versus Board. It brings us to the end of segregation and the renunciation of Plessy versus Ferguson. And my father is still around, of course, because he becomes again president of Morris Brown in Atlanta. And there, in the middle of the ferment and success that Martin Luther King has achieved in Montgomery, he realizes that the success of his own people had, in a sense, committed them to Plessy and not to a rush into integration because of the dispossession of all the things that they had as teachers, businessmen, bankers, and what have you. Competition will be risky. And you have then a good literature being written and vouched and expressed by my father, expressed by Tamika Brown Nagin, a very fine Bancroft historian who has analyzed the situation in Atlanta at that time, because Atlanta becomes the foci of what is really possible in terms of advancement, and the resistance both of blacks established and whites in aspect is fascinating to watch. But I think there is, as one steps back, there's another lesson, and it is that in the dark period that Rayford Logan called the nadir from the 1890s until 1950, you would say, well, gee, these people were sent off into the woods, as it were. Whatever they did the best they could. But by George, look, we finally began to try to give them the rights that they wanted and that the students demanded. But in that period, there is such a remarkable assertion of will and of competence and of institutional success that has to be remembered as well. And that, I think, is, again, a service of this book. I'm as excited as anybody by Julian Bond coming, but I think the intermediate period of the nadir is not as bleak as one has thought.
I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, but why don't you come up and grab a copy of the book? Thank you so much.
Thank you.